Welcome to 2024 Highline College Professional Development Day. And guess what? Our topic is Microsoft 365 Excel makes educational tasks easy. And check this out. Here's the 4 topics we're going to look at in this video. We're going to see something brand new. Dynamic spilled array formulas, and not the VLOOKUP, but the XLOOKUP function to calculate grades. We'll see dynamic spilled array formulas to build a budget. And then we'll see how to use Power Query, a feature inside of Excel, to import grades from Canvas, and then just hit refresh. And inside of Excel, the new data from Canvas will appear. And then finally, we'll see how to use the amazing PivotTable feature to summarize survey data from students and create some quite remarkable reports with just a few clicks. Now you can download the files to follow along from people.highline.edu. Girvin. Here are the links, or just click on the links below this YouTube video. The PDF file here, that just has a written summary of what's in the video. And this Excel file, you want to download it and follow along with what you see in the video. Now in our workbook file, we want to click on the Gradebook sheet. Now I already have some data here. Later in the video, I'll show you how to import this using Power Query. But here's the situation. We have students. Here's tests and quizzes. Here are the scores. Here's the max score for each one of the assignments. Now, I've already created a few formulas here. If I click in this cell right here and hit the F2 key to put the cell in edit mode, you can see I've already created a formula using the sum function. Now, we'll come back to that in just a second. F2 in this cell, I've done the same thing here. But before I can teach you about dynamic spilled array formulas, which will make your formula creating life in Excel much easier, I want to talk about how we used to create formulas. Now, our goal right here is to calculate the percentage grade for each student. Here's the partial points out of 520. For student number 2, partial points out of 520. So what do? We take the part divided by the whole. Now, when we do this in Excel, we create a formula, and an equal sign starts all formulas. And instead of typing the number in, we could take our cursor and click on the cell. That way, if any of this updates, the sum function here will update, and our percentage grade will update. Now we need division, so we used /, and then we click on the 520. Now, normally we hit Enter. The formula goes in the cell, and the cursor goes down one row. But I don't want to do that, because I'm immediately going to copy the formula, which means I need that cell to remain selected. So I'm going to use Control-Enter. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot, but that's one click saved up over your whole life. That's about enough time for a free vacation. Now, we get 82.88. Later, we'll look up the decimal grade in this column. But I want to copy this formula down. Now, we're going to point with our cursor. Right now, we have the selection cursor. That is called the move cursor. We don't want that one. When you hover over that little green box that's called the fill handle, there's the crosshair. Or that's what Bill Gates calls it, crosshair. I like to call it angry rabbit. Now, we're going to click and drag to copy the formula all the way down. And what? We have errors, and this person got 179%. Well, let's click in the second cell and hit F2. What happened is we used relative cell references. The K8 is really not K8. It's one cell to the left. That way, when we copy this formula down, it's always getting the part. But K5, that moved. That's a relative cell reference. 1, 2, 3 up, and 1 to the left. That's not what we want. So we want to come back up to the top cell, F2 to put it in edit mode. Make sure that your cursor is touching the K4, not over here, but right here. And hit the F4 key. The F4 key puts the $ in. That locks this. The column reference K and the row reference 4 is locked. So now when I Control-Enter, and then click and drag down. Go to the last cell and hit F2. Bam, our formula is working. Relative cell reference, that's called an absolute cell reference. Now, I want you to notice something about this formula because it's very different than a dynamic spilled array formula. F2, enter, F2, enter, F2. Every single cell has a formula. Not only that, but there's a single item operator, just a division math operator, and another single item. This is called a single input, single output formula. We put in single items, and of course, it delivers one answer. Also, notice that we had to enter it and manually copy it down. Also, notice that when we had to edit the top cell and then recopy it down. Now let's highlight. This is the selection cursor, and use your delete key. Now let's try a dynamic spilled array formula. And there's 3 amazing benefits. Equals, instead of a relative cell reference, you highlight all the cell references that would have been relative cell references. Type divide. Click on the 520. You don't have to lock it. Control Enter. And what? It calculated every single item. Now I'm going to hit F2 for a second. This is an array formula because what? There's not a single item on either side of the operator. There are multiple items. As soon as you have multiple items, that tells the formula, hey, I need to calculate an answer for each one. Now, one benefit, we didn't have to lock the cell reference. Another benefit, guess what? We didn't have to manually copy. And if we had to edit the formula, we just edit in the top cell, and it automatically recopies down. Now let's learn some other important things about dynamic spilled array formulas. There I can see it in the top cell, but click in the second cell. What? It's like a ghost. It's all grayed out. Every single cell below does not have the formula. There's just a result. That's the only cell that has the formula. Now let's click in the second cell and F2. There's nothing there. That's because the formula only lives in the top cell. Remember, we didn't have to lock because there's just one formula. We didn't have to copy because there's spilling. And that top cell is the only one we have to edit in. Now, what does it mean, F2, that there's nothing there? Well, if we come over to the side and create a different formula, I'm going to click on this cell. Remember, nothing's actually there, but internally, this new formula knows that it should go and get that value and use it in some formula. Now I'm going to use Control-Z to undo that. Another thing about dynamic spilled array formulas, don't put anything in the way of spilling. If I type a word here, Control-Enter, it's polite. It says, hey, I can't spill because there's something in the way. As soon as I click here and delete, wow, there it is. Now, F2, that's our first dynamic spilled array formula. Now let's try using the XLOOKUP function to look up each grade. For example, 82.88, that's really 0.8288. The way we're going to do this is we're going to have a formula look up this value. It's going to race through the first column until it finds the first biggest value, 0.83, and then it knows to jump back, and the grade will be 2.8. Another way to think of this is the XLOOKUP function will look this value up, and it's going to find an exact match or the next smaller. And since there is no exact match, the next smaller for 82.88 is 0.82. So 2.8 will be returned by the formula. Now let's try this. Equals XLOOKUP. We need a lookup value. And then I'm going to type a comma to get to the next argument. And watch the bold, comma, and lookup array. That's where it's going to try and find an exact match or the next smaller. I'm going to click. And instead of dragging my selection cursor down, we're going to use keyboards because they're faster. Control-Shift-Down arrow. That keyboard works because it goes down until it sees the first empty cell, and then it knows to stop. Now, Control-Backspace is another killer keyboard because it jumps back to the active cell. it doesn't matter where you are in the spreadsheet. Thousands of rows down, Control backspace just jumps back to the active cell. All right, so we have our lookup array, comma, return array. Well, that's where when it finds a match in lookup array, it'll return from the corresponding position whatever the decimal grade is. Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace. Now, comma, if not found, we don't actually need that because we were smart. The first percentage grade was 0. The last one is 0.94. That covers all the possibilities. But if instead of getting an error, there was a possibility of not finding a match, you could put something there. I'm going to skip it, so I type a comma. Match mode. This is where we get to decide what type of lookup. And we want exact match or next smaller. Now, when you click, you can double click also. It'll put that -1. You can also hit tab. You can also just type -1 in. I'm going to hit tab. There are a few other arguments here. And in the PDF notes, I explain every single one of these arguments. Now, close parentheses, Control Enter. Wait a second. It didn't spill. F2. This is a single item. Single input, single output. Instead of just putting a single item, forget that. I'm putting all of them in. That instructs XLOOKUP to find a grade for every one of the values we put into lookup value. Now, it's got the whole range here, but what's that pound symbol? That's actually called the spilled range operator. And because the formula only lives in the top cell, it only lists the cell with the formula. And then pound, spilled range operator, that says, please get everything that spills from that cell. Control Enter, and that is a thing of beauty. Dynamic spilled array formulas gave us all the grades. Now, I want to talk about something important since we're talking about formulas. If you click in this cell, here's in the home number group, that's number formatting. Every single cell has percentage. What happens if I highlight, and instead of clicking the drop down and using this one that most of the time politely gives you 2 decimals there, let's click this option. And notice the screen tip is not helpful. It says format as a %. Well, it should say format as a %, and I'm not going to show any of the decimals for fractions of a %. Now look at what happens here. 83. Well, 2.8, that doesn't make sense. Remember F2 right here? We told match mode to find exact match or the next smallest. Well, let's manually do this. I'm going to look up 83. I'm looking through here. There it is. Well, that's an exact match. 2.9. Why did it not get that? The reason is simple. This is number formatting. Number formatting does not change the underlying number. It only displays it on the surface as having no decimals. If we really wanted to hack off all those decimals, we'd have to use something like the round function. And this is paramount to creating formulas because F2, formulas do not see number formatting. Now I want to show you something else. I already pre-formatted this as a % with 2 decimals. But let's highlight all these. Here's the drop down. And right at the top, this is general. What it does is it wipes away any number formatting that you might have applied and shows you the actual number in the cell. I always think of this as the eraser. So I'm going to click. And sure enough, even if I click and drag to increase the column width, there's all sorts of extra decimals. Now in the top cell F2, when the formula made this calculation, this is the unrounded decimal with lots of decimal places. That's the actual number that's in the cell. That's the actual number, F2, that the formula uses. And it doesn't matter what kind of number formatting we put on the surface, the formula never sees number formatting. It's always going to take the underlying number, and in this case, race through, find that there's not an exact match. But here's the next smaller. It gets to 2.8 and brings it to the cell. Now let's highlight. and apply number formatting, notice that nothing changes. Click. There it is. It looks on the surface, because of number formatting, like we changed the number to 83%. That would be 0.83. But that's not what's happening here. That's just something that we see on the surface. Formulas F2 do not see number formatting. If it did, of course, it would race through, find an exact match, and return 2.9. But that's not what any formula ever does. It sees the underlying number. So bam, there's the next smallest. 2.8 is returned to the cell. Now I'm going to highlight. And I'm going to use increased decimal, 1, 2. And when we're creating formulas, it is our duty to apply a number formatting that doesn't confuse the user. Here, we've increased the decimals so we can clearly see it's not 83%. It's 82.88. And remember, those other decimals are there also. F2 formulas do not see number formatting. Now, we've created 1, 2 dynamic spilled array formulas. But let's go look at what happens when we use the sum function, F2. Well, enter F2, enter F2. That's definitely not spilling. And here's the reason why. The calculation that it's making is called an aggregate calculation. That means it takes many items, or an array of items, but it can only deliver one answer. Sum is an example of an aggregate calculation. Average, again, what does average do? If we take all these different numbers, we add them up, divide by the count, and that gives us the average. That's another example of an aggregate calculation. Max, finding the biggest amongst many, that's another example of an aggregate calculation. Well, here's the thing. F2, there's no way you can use the sum function to spill. Just as an example, delete. We're going to use the keyboard for the sum function, Alt equals. And let's just highlight. I want it to actually spill and calculate a total for each row. Well, of course, it's impossible, because the definition of an aggregate formula, F2, is take many and deliver one. Well, Microsoft thought of this. If they're going to allow Control-Z, dynamic spilled array formulas, they said, well, we better do something about sum, average, and other aggregate formulas. Delete. And here's what they did. By row. They want you to put in an array that has multiple rows, comma, and then for function, which is an aggregate calculation, we just type SUM, close parentheses. And now when I hit enter, it has no problem spilling the results. There's the formula. Every single one below the top cell is a ghost. The top one, F2, that's the actual formula. Now, of course, by rows, but what if you want to do an aggregate calculation by column? Well, Microsoft thought of that too. By col. Hey, there's the array, comma, down arrow, tab, close parentheses, control, enter. Now, I want to edit F2. I really want this to go and get an average for the total and the percentage grade all the way to decimal grade. Now, I could come over here, double click. Once I've highlighted it, it's in edit mode, so I can redirect it. And now that I've redirected the array, control enter, now it spills across. The columns giving us the average for tests, quizzes, total percent grade, and decimal grade. Now I'm going to control Z, and notice it got rid of that edit, F2. Here's another way. If you see the blue highlighted range with a solid line, point to the corner. And when you see that diagonal cursor, then you can simply drag. And now by col will spill all the averages. All right, an example, number one, we saw how to create dynamic spilled array formulas using the XLOOKUP function, percentage grade formula, and by row and by col. Now, let's see if we can take our newly acquired dynamic spilled array formula skills and apply them to a different situation. Let's go to the sheet budget. All right, on the sheet budget, we have a typical budget that might be done in an accounting department. Here at the top, we have sales. These are the estimated sales for each month, and then a total for the 6-month period. Off to the side, we have our expenses listed and some percentages or decimals that represent expenses as a percent of sales. So for example, right here in March, if we were creating each formula individually, we would estimate cost of goods sold expense for March by taking, hey, there's the sales times the percentage. Control Enter, 10,266. Now Control Z. Now luckily, we set this up smartly. At the top of each column, for example, right here, this formula is going to use March from the top of the column, and it's going to use advertising percent from the head of the row. If you get a table like this, which is common in business or even worse in academic textbooks, they'll give students percentages horizontally and sales horizontally. In that case, you can't use a single dynamic spilled array formula. You'd actually have to calculate an individual expense for each row. But we were smart. Horizontal sales, vertical decimals. Now we can create a single formula equals, here's the sales, horizontal row, times vertical decimals. Now notice, this defines a rectangle. So when I hit Enter, that is amazing. Every single one of the expenses spilled into the rectangular range. Now, if you don't believe it, let's just try one. Equals, hey, there's June times the tax percent. Control Enter. And sure enough, we got exactly the same thing. Now, let me show you, just for comparison, how F2, easy that is, and how hard it used to be in the past. And this is even if you set the table up correctly. Here's the old school formula. Equals January revenues. Well, we have to use it all the way down the column. But when the formula copies to the side, we need that blue one to move. So I'd have to hit the F4 key 1, 2 times. Lock the row, but not the column. Times, hey, there's the expense at the head of the row. This needs to move relatively down the rows, but be locked as it goes across the columns. So we had to hit F4 1, 2, 3 times. Lock the column, not the row. And then we had to Control Enter, copy it down, let go, and then copy it to the side. Go to the diagonally furthest cell away and hit F2. Well, I didn't quite go far enough, but I went to May. But you can see the formula is working. That is just too much work. This is the magic of dynamic spilled array formulas in Microsoft 365. Now here's your bonus trick. What if your boss actually gave you a horizontal table? Well, to do a dynamic spilled array, we need it in a column, and we need the sales in a row. So we can use the toCol function. I'm just going to take the horizontal values, and I'm going to enter it just for a second so we can see it's exactly the correct orientation as these values over here. F2 times the sales, Control Enter, and wow, that'll do the trick. Now, in accounting, when we want to calculate net income, that's the profit, we need total expenses and total revenues for a particular period. Well, we need to spill column totals to add up the expenses, so we equals BYCOL. There's the array, comma, and then the function will be sum. Enter. So now for June, we can take total sales minus total expenses, and that'll give us our profit or net income. Equals, hey, there's one monthly expense for each cell minus the same size array. So each individual corresponding cell will be subtracted, and that's the net income. Now the last thing to do is get a total for the 6-month period for all of our expenses, total expenses, and net income. Not by call, but by row. Hey, there's the array. And I'm going all the way down to net income. comma, SUM. That's the aggregate calculation that's going to be calculated in each row. And when I hit Enter, that is the spill total. Down at the bottom, that's the total net income or profit for the entire period. Dynamic spilled array formulas have revolutionized how easy it is to create worksheet formulas. All right, now our next exciting example, we're going to go over to the sheet Power Query. Now on the worksheet Power Query, this is where we're going to eventually load our Canvas score data. And this file, if I go over to Windows Explorer and look, I have it stored on the desktop in a particular folder. There's the folder path. I can see the Excel file I'm using. Now, when we go over to Canvas, the way Canvas exports data is in a CSV file. I have View, this is in Windows Explorer, File Name Extensions turned on. That's important. I'm going to turn this on. It's not that it's important, it's just polite because I can see .xlsx. When we download our Canvas scores, it's not going to be in an Excel file. It's going to be in a .csv file. And we're going to load it to the same location. Now, here's Canvas. I have this class Business 430 Fun with Excel and Power Query. There are some students, total 5 assignments. We have some scores that have already been completed, some that have not. Now we want to export this, and later we'll export it once we get new data, and then everything will update in Excel. Let's click the Export drop-down, Export Entire Gradebook. Click. It's creating a CSV file. It's polite. It says, hey, I'm going to give you the option of deciding where this goes. That's the Save As dialog box. I want to go to the desktop. And there's my folder. I can see the same folder path. We don't see anything here, even though there are files, because anytime you use Save As and you have a particular file type selected, it acts as a filter. All right, I definitely want to name this file. I just called it Business 430 Canvas Scores. Click Save. Do not click here to open it. Let's go over to Windows Explorer, and sure enough, now we can see there's our scores. Notice .csv. Notice .xlsx. Now I want to show you what CSV means. It actually means comma separated values. That means between each bit of data, student ID and test scores, there's a comma separating the bits of data. Now, if you open this, it looks like an Excel file, but it's not. It's a CSV file. To see what's really going on, right-click, Open with Notepad or WordPad. I'll use Notepad. And sure enough, we can see commas separate all the bits of data. Now I want to close this, go back to our Excel file, and now we want to import data, get and transform data group, and queries and connection group. These constitute all of the buttons that make up Power Query. And there, right in Get and Transform Data, there's From Text CSV. Let's click. We want to navigate to our file. There it is, desktop. There's the folder path. I see .csv. I'm going to double click. It wants to ask a few questions before it gives us the option of cleaning and transforming our data. The file origin, that's perfect. Delimiter, this is important. Ours is a comma. That just means the character that separates the bits of data. And data detection, well, we only have 10 rows, not 200, so that doesn't matter. Now, do not click Load. Do not load it. We want to be polite and bring it into the Power Query editor so we can clean and transform the data. Click Transform Data. Here's the Power Query editor. Here's a preview of our data. Over here, that's the name of our query. That's fine. And Power Query has already created a few steps. It got the source, CSV file, promoted headers. That means we have field names, and added some data types. Now, let's X this out because, as I'll show you in just a moment, we want to add our own data types. That's just a way of cleaning your data to make sure numbers are numbers and text is text. I'm going to get rid of that step by clicking the red X. Now let's go over in the upper left-hand corner. click that drop-down arrow. And there's this great option, Choose Columns. I want to uncheck everything, select Student ID, and we have 5 different tests. There it is. These are the only columns I want to import. This is an example of transforming the data. I don't need most of those columns. I just need these. Click OK. And now we got rid of a bunch of columns. We have student name, ID, and some scores. Now, the first row, possible points, that's not really part of our data set. We don't want it. So we're going to further transform this. Home, reduce rows, remove top rows. We'll say 1, click OK, but watch what happens over here. It adds a new step. This is actually an amazing feature in Power Query. It memorizes all the steps. If later you need to change something, you just come back and change it, and everything will update. The next thing I want to do is I want to change these long names. So I'm going to double click, and I'm just going to put T1 for test 1. Now, something cool about Power Query, we see all the steps, and we see this new step here, rename columns. But let's open up the formula bar. You don't need to know any of this, but there are some really easy to understand functions that Power Query builds for us. This is, in essence, a formula that transforms a particular step. Table.rename columns. It's acting on the previous step. Remove top rows. And there's the first name change. Watch what happens when I double click the second test and type T2. Oh, it's writing the formula for us. Double click test 3. That is so cool. Test 4. And then finally test 5. Now notice we don't have anything in those particular assignments yet. But there's our completed formula. We can close this. Perhaps the most important thing when importing data, especially from Canvas, is notice these are not numbers. These are aligned to the left, which means Power Query and Excel will consider them text. That means if we try to do calculations with them, they won't work like numbers. So in Power Query, before we import, we always come up to the top of the column, the field header, and in the left-hand corner, you can click, in this case, ABC, because it already applied a text data type. We want, for all of our numbers, decimal number. And there is the icon 1.2. Now, in Power Query, you can't have empty cells. They call it null. That just means the absence of data. But for each one of these, we want to make sure to add the correct data type, decimal. By the way, if you didn't do this, when you loaded it to Excel, it would look OK, but it definitely would not calculate like numbers. And then we want to come over decimal number, decimal number, decimal number. If I use the horizontal scroll bar, ID is fine if it's text. Same with name. There's our applied steps. Now we can load. Let's come up to Home, Close, click the drop down, and then select Close and Load To. This gives us the power to decide where to load it. We definitely want it as a table on the existing sheet. You can see the dancing ant, so that's where it's going to go. Click OK. And there we have imported our data. Now it comes as an Excel table. Over here, we can see the Queries and Connections pane. If we ever need to edit, we simply double click, and we can come back and adjust any of the steps we want. From experience, I know what the #1 error is. People forget to add data types. So if your data, number data, downloads as text, just come back and change the data type. Then, instead of close and load 2, which is grayed out, it already knows where you want to load this, so you click Close and Load. Also, if this pane is closed, you come up to Data, Queries and Connections, and click this button, and it opens up the pane. Now, over here we have the max points. I'm going to change the column width for each one of the assignments that are completed. Later, when I import and get test 4, I'm going to type 100 here. Very importantly, to get all of our percent formulas and decimal grade formulas correct, make sure in F2 add all the cells, including the empty ones where we don't have a max score yet. Now, you could incorporate the formulas for calculating grade right into the table. And when you refresh the query, everything updates, including the formulas. But when you use an Excel table, you have to use the old school formulas where you lock the cell references. So I'm going to do mine one column over. This is going to be total, tab, percent grade, tab, decimal grade, tab. I'm going to add some bold. And right here, let's do our total formula. All right, we're going to use by row because we want a total for each row. There is all of the tests, not just the ones we've completed, but the ones that are not completed yet. That's called table formula nomenclature. Lists the table name, which is also our query name. And then in square brackets, the field name separated by a colon, comma. We want to sum by each row. Tab, there's our total. Equals, and watch this, arrow key over. I could use Control-Shift-Down arrow, but guess what? That's a dynamic spilled array. And how do you refer to a dynamic spilled array? Well, the top cell plus pound. And then we're going to divide it by 300. Tab. Those are our decimals. We could add percentage number format if we want. Equals XLOOKUP, arrow key pound, comma, lookup array. This is where we're trying to get a match. Control-Shift-Down arrow, Control backspace, comma, return array. This is the decimal grade. Control-Shift-Down arrow, Control backspace, comma. We're not going to put anything for if found because we covered all possibilities, comma. Match mode, well, it's going to be -1. Exact match or next smaller. Close parentheses, and there are the grades. We could add some formatting if we'd like. Home. The bucket. There's the green I like. All right, I finished my formatting with some other fill, font, border, and even some number formatting. Now, let's go to our updated Canvas website and download a new CSV file. Here we are in Canvas. We have some new scores. Now, if this Canvas website was like an SQL database website, we could just connect directly. But that's not the way it works. We have to download a new CSV file each time. Export, export entire gradebook. Save as dialog box. There's our folder. I can see this previous file. Now, I'm going to click a single time. That renames it. If I double-clicked it, it would replace it. But I want to add a number to the end, so this file is different. 01. Now I can click Save. Over in Windows Explorer, I'm just verifying. See, and sure enough, we have 01. Now over in Excel, I'm going to show you a few different ways to update so we get the new data. I can go back to the query, double-click. Back in the Power Query Editor, I can go back to the original source step. And there's a function called csv.document. If I open this up, there's the file path. If I come to the end, I can type a 01. And I'm going to click the check mark over here. If I click Close and Load to, just like that, I get my updated data. Now I need to come over and type 100 and Enter. And now this is updated. All the percents and decimal grades are updated. Now let's try that one more time. Now at Canvas, we have some new scores. Export. And I'm going to name this one with a 2 at the end. Click Save. Back in Excel. Another way to do it, and this is the way I usually do it, is you come up to Data, click the Get Data dropdown, Data Source. That means we have some data source. These are the settings. We select our file path. There it is, 01. Change source. And you can browse. You can also just edit, but we can browse. Double-click the file. OK. Click Close. It didn't update, but we need to refresh. So we can come over and click Refresh. And then be sure to come up and change the max score from 0 to 100. And everything's updated. All right, that was a lot of fun with Power Query to import data and create a gradebook. Now we're going to go over to the sheet Pivot Tables. All right, on this sheet, if you've never used a pivot table before, you are going to be amazed at how easy it is to create reports. Now we have some survey data from students. Here in the class preference, we have flexible, hybrid, online, high flex, and face-to-face. And then the pathway from education, human services, and law, all the way to business, hospitality, and tourism. And the goal is to create from this column here a unique list and get the count and percent of total. Now, if you were going to do this by hand, boy, that's a lot of work. But with a pivot table, we can create this kind of report with just a few clicks. Now notice this report right here uses a single column, but we can use both columns and answer questions like what percent of students are STEM pathway and took an online class, or what percentage of STEM students took an online class. Pivot table can answer these again with just a few clicks. Now, before creating this report by going to Insert Tables Group and using the Pivot Table dropdown, I want to think about the structure of this report because it will help us understand the Pivot Table user interface where we create the report. Notice in the row area, we have a unique list of items from the Student Class Preference column, and then we make some calculations for each. With that in mind, this is a picture, so I'm going to slide it off to the side. Here's how you create a pivot table. Now we have a proper data set, field names or column headers in the first row, records in subsequent rows. You click in a single cell before you click the pivot table button. You don't want your cursor outside. Single cell, then you go to Insert Tables, Pivot Table dropdown, and here's the one we want. Our table of data is coming from a table or a range in the worksheet. So I click. Because we had a single cell selected, it's polite. It knew exactly where the data set is. We want it not on a new worksheet. We want it on existing. We can move this to the side, and I'm going to put it right in cell E5. Click OK. Our report will appear here as we take field names, these are the two column headers, and drag them to the correct area. Now remember, our goal is to create a unique list from student class preferences. So watch this. Student class preferences. I'm going to click and drag this field down to where? The row area. And instantly I get a unique list. Now we want to count. And down here, values, you can see that sigma, that's the symbol Excel uses for sum. But when we drag a text field, remember these are text items, the only calculation it can do is count. So when you drag text down to values, it defaults to count. But that's exactly what we want. There's that 130 for online. Now I want to come up and rename this. So I select the cell, count, and enter. I want to change the column width, so I click between F and G and drag. Now we're going to drag the same field down again below count in the values area. It defaults to count, but we can right-click anywhere in this column and change the calculation two ways. If you hover over Summarize Values By, these are all the aggregate calculations. And it's smart. It knows that text we can count, but we can't sum, average, max, min. But once we know the aggregate calculation is count, then we can come down to Show Values As, and there's all sorts of amazing calculations. Percent of column total, that's what we want. What does that mean? Here's the column total, 350. It's going to take each individual item and compare it with division to 350. Our first show value as calculation, percent of column total. And just like that, we've created our report. Now, I'd like to sort this biggest to smallest. Pivot table used to have an option up here, but now we're going to just use the regular options, either up in Data, Sort and Filter, Z to A, or you can simply right-click. There it is, Sort, Z to A, largest to smallest. And there's our finished report. Online, 37%. Flexible, 25%. So clearly, we can see that face-to-face and high flex, they have the lowest percentage, the least amount of demand from students. Now for our second pivot table, I want to hide some columns. So I'm going to select with my downward pointing black arrow E, drag to H, right-click, hide. Later, when you want to unhide, you highlight D and I and right-click unhide. Now we want to answer these questions here using a pivot table. Now each one of these questions involves two variables, the STEM pathway and from this column here, online class. That means we get to create a cross-tab report. We're going to have a unique list of class preferences in the row and then pathway across the columns. Here's how amazingly easy it is. Click in a single cell, insert, pivot table dropdown from table range. I want to put it in the existing I-12, click OK. And sure enough, there's our field names and row and columns. I'm going to drag student class preferences down to row. Instantly, we get a unique list. Pathway over to columns. There's a unique list. Now, once you get variables across the column and row, it really doesn't matter which one of the text fields we're going to drag down here, because it'll just count based on two conditions. When we get to this column, STEM, online, right there will be the count of records that have both STEM and online. So over here, here's a STEM and online. Notice this is an and logical test. We're asking, hey, is pathway equal to STEM and is class preference equal to online? We can see down here, there's a bunch more. So only when both conditions are met will this cell get a single count. All right, I'm going to drag class preferences down to values. And sure enough, there are 33 records over here where the class was online and the pathway was STEM. Now up in the corner, I'm just going to change this to count and enter. And now we have quite a remarkable report. It's called a cross tab because if we highlight this column, this is for pathway elective, and class type hybrid, it looks like a cross. And the intersecting cell, that tells us the and logical test result. Hey, there's 3 records where the pathway was elective and the class type was hybrid. But it gets even better in a cross-tab report because check this out. Here's the variables for class preference. And over here, these are the same counts we got in our first report. So we have the and result in the middle. We have the straight single condition counts over here and down at the bottom too. So for STEM, there were 87 students who reported that their pathway was STEM. That makes answering all sorts of different questions easy when you have a cross-tab report. For example, this first question, what is the percent of students with STEM pathway and online classes? Well, we simply take the count of 33 and compare it to the grand overall total. However, if we ask a question like, what percent of online students are STEM pathway, we're not talking about all of them. We're only talking about the online student total. So here it is right there. 130 becomes the denominator, and 33 becomes the numerator. Similarly, what percentage of STEM students took an online class? Well, bam, there's the denominator, there's the numerator. All 3 answers will give us completely different percentages. And the pivot table makes it easy to do this. We don't have to manually calculate. Now, let's answer our first question. What percent of students are in STEM pathway and took an online class? That means we need to compare all the interior numbers, the 2 condition counts, single condition here and single condition number there. Every one of those numbers to the grand overall total. Anywhere in the numbers, right-click. We'll use our amazing show values as, and there it is, percent of grand total. Instantly, we see 9.43% of the students were in STEM pathway and an online class. We also can see from our first report of all those students, 37% were in online class. We can also see that about 25% of the students were in the STEM pathway. Now let's answer the second question. What percent of online students are STEM pathway? Well, guess what? As soon as we say percent of online students, that's not the grand total. That's just the online students, which was 130. Well, that means, and I'm going to Control Z to undo that. That means we need to compare every one of these numbers, 11, 13, 9, 19, to the online total of 130. That means we want percent of row total. Right click. There's our amazing show values as percent of row total. And now we get our answer of online students. About 25% were in the STEM pathway. If we select a different intersecting cell for high flex, about 12% were in the elective pathway. Now, this is percent of row. Let's try question number 3. What percent of STEM students took an online class? Now we're isolating on as the denominator STEM. So we need to change this column and do, actually for all the columns, percent of column total. Show values as percent of column total. And there we get our answer. Of the 87 STEM students we had, about 38% took an online class. If we look at this intersection here, just looking at the elective pathway, about 19% took high flex classes. Wow, that was a lot of amazing tricks with Microsoft 365 Excel. We saw how to take student survey data, use the PivotTable tool, and create useful reports. We saw how to export data from Canvas, use Power Query to import it, and create a gradebook. We saw the amazing power of dynamic spilled array formulas when we built a budget, and we started it off. Dynamic spilled array formulas to build a gradebook, and the amazing XLOOKUP function. All right, we'll see you next Professional Development Day.